Against all the evil that hell can conjure, all the wickedness that mankind can produce, we send against them only you. Rip and tear until it is done. Out of all the video games that are offered to us on a yearly basis, of all the forms of media that we're able to consume, some of my favorites have been the reimagined Doom games that have been releasing ever since 2016. As someone who works in a rather stressful line of work, sometimes there's nothing better than coming home and blasting bad guys apart until the cows come home. But the more time I spent playing these Doom games, the more I realized that there was a deep and encompassing lore hiding beneath the surface of this simple shoot-'em-up. So that's what we're talking about today, the Theology of Doom. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. Now, when I say we're going to talk about the theology of the Doom games, there's a couple prefaces that I want to put out there first. First of all, I haven't played any of the old school Doom games. We're going to be focusing on Doom 2016, Doom Eternal, and the newly released Doom the Dark Ages, all of which I like quite a bit. In fact, if I had to rank them, I would say I like 2016 the best, and I'd say Doom Eternal and Doom the Dark Ages right now for me are kind of tied for second place. They're both great, they just have a different play style. I think Doom Eternal is going to be remembered as the more fun of the two because it emphasizes mobility more, whereas Doom the Dark Ages kind of turns you into a walking tank, which is fun in its own right, but I think it's a little bit less challenging and a little bit less memorable than Eternal. So that's kind of where we're laying things out, for me personally, right now anyways. The other thing to consider is that these are video games. Their primary aim is to entertain, especially a video game like Doom. Video games can be amazingly educational and very deep in their storytelling and in their lore. But this is Doom we're talking about here. Doom is designed to basically be as cathartic, fast-paced, and shooty as possible. That's kind of the gameplay loop that we all know and love. Except for me, of course, I play Doom for the parkour. But when we're talking about the theology of Doom, it would be asking a lot for that theology to be as deep as actual theology is, as consistent as actual theology is, and as consistent between games as we would like it to be. We find that the theology of Doom isn't consistent between games. You can tell that the people who are making the lore and writing the stories were sort of making things up as they go along. That's not to say that it isn't fun, it's not to say that it isn't cool, but if we come across a situation where it's kind of like, well, this doesn't make sense because of this piece of lore over here, it's probably because there wasn't like this overarching storyline that they were working with the whole time. We're working with something more like the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where they're just kind of making it up as they go along, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Hard to think of a situation where it turned out better with Star Wars, but hey, this is Doom we're talking about. We're also going to spend most of our time in Doom Eternal today. Doom 2016 was very well-grounded, and that's one of the reasons why it's my favorite of the Doom games. It's kind of like, how do we take this and make it as realistic as possible? And I'm a sucker for realism, even in games like this, so I appreciated it. But there's not as much cosmic lore and very little theology at all in Doom 2016. And surprisingly, the same goes for the Dark Ages. Originally, this was going to be a prequel to the Dark Ages video, but as I played the Dark Ages, I realized there's not a whole lot of theology here, or not a whole lot of lore that builds on what we learned in Doom Eternal. In fact, it just sort of like sets up some of the points what we see play out in Doom Eternal since it's a prequel, but it doesn't really give us a whole lot of new meat to chew on. I suppose introducing, and spoiler alert by the way, introducing like literal Lovecraft elements and Cthulhu himself is technically updating the lore, but it's not giving us, the deep stuff that we're really interested in, pun intended. So we're going to be primarily focusing on Doom Eternal with important references to 16 and the Dark Ages as they come up. Before we begin, I want to bring up the fact that my educational background is in biblical studies. I have a Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis. I'm trained in ancient biblical languages and interpretive techniques. Now, this isn't to say that this is going to be the one only perspective on Doom that makes sense, and it isn't to say that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. I think it's just important to bring up where I'm coming from so that everybody knows the background for what I'm going to be saying herein. I think it's also healthy to bring up the fact that while I'm primarily going to be mining Doom's lore for biblical references, I also recognize that the Bible wasn't the only inspiration for Doom. As we look at the various inspirations for it, Lovecraft being the most recent addition, we see that it's drawing from a lot of different backgrounds. It's drawing from Western occultism, it's drawing from heavy metal albums of the 1980s, and if you ask some people, those two are the same thing. But it also is drawing heavily from several biblical themes, which kind of makes sense when you're playing with themes like God, the devil, angels, demons, hell, heaven, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to be primarily looking at these, but also looking for other cultural references and other inspirations in the Doom lore to sort of see what the different pieces they took from were as they're building this aggregate. With that being said, it doesn't take long digging into the lore of Doom before you start seeing the Bible references start popping up. So one of the big ones is that the primary conflict that's going on in the background of the whole Doom universe, at least in these three most recent games, is between a figure called the Father and a figure called the Dark Lord, whom we later come to find out is named Davoth. So already we have the sort of dualism of God versus the devil established here. This is drawing primarily from the Christian tradition, although God versus the devil also shows up in Judaism and Islam. But I would say that the form of dualism we find here of God versus Satan is particularly of the American variety. You could potentially say the Western variety. I'm not sufficiently familiar with modern European Christianity to say that. But in America, we have a very strong emphasis of God versus the devil, light versus dark, good versus evil. This kind of permeates all of our thinking. And even that explanation that I just laid out isn't exactly 100% how classical Christianity has portrayed it. Certainly Satan is the prince of darkness in classical Christian thought, but he's substantially more subservient to God and subordinate to God in power than is typically depicted in modern American depictions of this relationship between the two of them. In the modern West, or at least in modern America, we tend to view Satan and God as equal opposites, principles of good and evil that are locked in a struggle for control over the world. Whereas classically and more correctly in biblical theology, Christianity has viewed God as the prime principle from which all things are derived, including Satan. So let's start by talking about the figure of the Father in Doom. This clearly has Christian roots, but there are attestations of other father deities in various ancient religions. So El in Canaanite thought, and the Deus Pater of the Proto-Indo-European people and all of its later manifestations are two examples of this that come to mind. But the emphasis on a being called the Father, which is apparently omniscient and omnipotent as the sort of protagonist in a sense and the creator of the angel race in Doom, very clearly lends itself to a Christian background. So the Father in Doom is probably derived from Christian roots, at least in part. But there are some important distinctions to note here. For instance, in the codices of the Doom games, we find references to the Father making mistakes. He's portrayed as the creator of realms and the originator of sentient races, but he's also capable of making mistakes, like producing the realm that would eventually become Hell and creating a being within it, Davoth, who would ultimately rebel against him. And apparently the Father in the Doom universe wasn't aware that these things would happen. So we have an apparently super powerful deity. I wouldn't quite say omnipotent, but nevertheless, it's capable of making mistakes. And by definition, the Father in Christian theology is incapable of making mistakes. God has perfect foreknowledge of the future, perfect omniscience, and perfect omnipotence, and therefore is aware of all the fallout of any decisions that he would make. This leads to some very interesting, theological problems, like why would God create a world where he knows that angels would rebel, people would rebel, and suffering and death would take place. Big questions for perhaps another time. But nevertheless, in Christian theology, despite these problems, it's nevertheless affirmed that God knew about these things ahead of time and nevertheless chose to create the world anyways. In the Doom universe, it seems that the figure called the Father, despite having the ability to create realms, entire dimensions, and peoples to populate them with, was unaware of the future. So this seems to be a deity which is not quite omnipotent and not quite omniscient either. This makes the Father of Doom more, that's a great title, Father of Doom. Somebody make either a song or a metal album called that. But the Father in the Doom universe is more like the demiurge from Platonism. It's this thing that's sort of in the universe, creating other things that are in the universe, perhaps able to test the edges of the universe. But it's a thing in the universe. In Christian theology, and even more broadly in other schools of thought as well, God isn't a thing in the universe. The universe is a thing in God. You can think about it that way. So God is totally transcendent, beyond anything that we're capable of experiencing except through divine revelation. Whereas in Doom, the Father, despite being incredibly powerful, is a thing in the universe, and a thing that's capable of operating only within the universe, and which has limitations in and of itself. Still very clearly inspired by the Father from Christian theology, but noticeably distinct from it in several important ways. It's interesting to note that in the lore of Doom Eternal, we learn that the Father divested himself of physical form and encased himself within a life orb, or a life sphere, I believe it's called in the game. And this is really interesting because by definition, the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, wouldn't be able, I don't want to use a limiting language with God, but like the idea of reducing the form of God to a single point in space, if anything, could only be done in the incarnation of Jesus Christ himself. So I would say one does not simply lightly compress the Father of the Bible to a single point. And even when God does compress himself to a single point in the incarnation of Jesus, this is God the Son doing this. God the Father remains transcendent beyond everything else. Whereas in Doom, it seems that this demiurge figure, the Father, is capable of being compacted down to a life sphere. So he's capable of being contained and localized in a single point, which has its weakness. I actually just thought of the incarnation parallel there as I was saying this, so it probably came out a little bit weird, but to summarize, essentially, the Father in the Doom universe seems to be capable of being limited to a single point in space in time, whereas for the God of the Bible, the Father doesn't ever do this. The Son of God, God the Son, does undergo this willingly by incarnating as the person of Jesus. And that brings me to my next point. After the Father figure in Doom is compressed to a life sphere, his caretaker, Samuel Hayden, or Samor the Seraphim, which we'll get to in a second here, takes on a form reminiscent of a human being and goes to Earth, taking the Father with him. He uploads the Father's intelligence to a massive artificial intelligence system he's produced called Vega. And so Vega is sort of the thought process of the Father, which is trying to help humankind stop the oncoming onslaught of demons and the forces of hell. So what's interesting here is that the lore of Doom tells us that Vega wasn't 100% sure that he was the Father, or at least he wasn't aware of his vastness and his broadness. And the reason this is interesting is because this also is very reminiscent of the incarnation of Christ himself. Theologians debate over how much awareness Jesus had of his divine nature. Classically, it would be believed that Jesus was fully aware that he was entirely human and entirely God at the same time. Some more recent theologians have suggested that perhaps Jesus, while he was on earth, while he was incarnated as a human, had a somewhat limited knowledge. One does wonder how you're simultaneously thinking of the operations of the entire cosmos and also what you're eating for breakfast in the morning. That's a little bit beyond my pay grade to comment on, but I do think it's interesting. So we've talked a little bit about the Father and his connections to God the Father in Christian theology, but now let's talk about his rival a little bit, the Dark Lord Davoth. Davoth, as we find it in the Maker Codices in Doom Eternal, was one of the early creations of the Father. He was a primordial being, and as such, he was an immortal being tasked with stewarding a realm towards the Father's plans. The realm he inhabited was called Jakad. It was one of the earliest, if not the first realms that the Father created and was populated with sentient beings. Although the one difference between Davoth and his subjects is that Davoth, being a primordial, was immortal. He couldn't die, or at least not for a very long time, while his subjects were mortal. So while the realm of Jakad under the rule of Davoth achieved great technological wonders and beautiful artistry, the problem of death remained for its people. And Davoth was very, very empathetic to his subjects who were dying, which is something that he wasn't capable of doing. So Davoth sets out on a quest to find the secret to immortality so that out of his empathy, he can sort of bring all of his people to his level, or at least stave off death. For relatively murky reasons, the Father decides at this point to shut off access to Jakad from the outside. So the realm of Jakad with Davoth and his subjects in it was basically put in a little bubble. It couldn't access the other realms in the area there. Possibly the reason for this is because Davoth and the inhabitants of Jakad actually were successful in finding out how to achieve immortality, and that is by using Argent Energy. Argent Energy, which is one of the major plot points of all three Doom games, is basically refined souls. Basically, the souls of human beings and other sentient life is, well, first of all, ripped from their bodies through torturous methods, and then refined down into an energy source that prolongs the life of anybody who is exposed to it. So it's possible that Davoth and the inhabitants of Jakad found out how to make Argent Energy, and then were basically harvesting the souls of other peoples to fuel their own immortality. This is kind of hinted at in the lore, but it's not, I don't think, explicitly declared. Maybe somebody in the comments can correct me on that, but that's sort of what I picked up in my research for this video. So this may be the reason that the Father locked Davoth in Jakad and shut off contact between that realm and the outside, but it's not entirely sure what had happened. What is sure is that Davoth did not take kindly to being shut up inside his realm, and so he started looking for ways to get out and converting the realm of Jakad into a dictatorship which was poised to spring its trap on everybody else outside of the realm of Jakad. And it's around this time that the realm of Jakad began to be called Hell. So with Davoth the Dark Lord, we do find a couple of resonances with the story of Satan from Christian theology, but not quite as many as I was expecting. Like Satan, Davoth was originally created good by the Father. He was set in a place where he could oversee the processes of a realm and carry out the Father's plan, similar to how Christian theology represents this. And like Satan, Davoth eventually decides to go his own way, and this leads to conflict between Satan/Davoth and the Father. But what's interesting is that the reason for Davoth's rebellion here is the goodwill of his own people. Davoth was highly empathetic to the fate that mortal beings would inevitably experience in the Father's plan, and he took their side against apparently the Father's side. Whereas in Christian theology, Satan was selfish, he was prideful, he wanted to set himself up as being higher than God, and this is what precipitated his eventual downfall. Now, it's important to note that this depiction of the Prince of Darkness has resonances with a relatively recent, and by recent I mean early modern to present, depiction of the devil as something of an anti-hero. In these depictions, which find their ultimate basis most of the time in John Milton's Paradise Lost, though there are other influences for this, depict Satan as this sort of misunderstood or empathetic figure. Sometimes he empathizes with the human condition, our inability to attain immortal life, our ignorance, our blindness, and our tendency to destroy one another. Think of the TV show Lucifer, or the aforementioned Paradise Lost, which was written almost 500 years ago. But this rehabilitated Satan is very different from the Satan that we find in Christian tradition. Essentially, the Satan of Christian lore is a figure who is directly responsible for or intricately tied to all of the evil that we see in the world. It's 2025, there's a lot of bad stuff happening in the world right now. Pick one of those things. In Christian theology, Satan is somehow responsible for that, either directly or indirectly. So the attempt to rehabilitate Satan into sort of an anti-hero or an empathetic figure, I think is a little bit wrong-headed, because properly understood, the devil of Christian lore is the manifestation of human evil, or it's the face behind human evil, one or the other. So essentially, if you have a devil that you can empathize with, either you're a serial killer or that isn't the devil truly. Now again, Doom is a video game. It's clearly riffing on these ideas, not making broad theological claims, but I just don't want anybody walking away thinking that this is actually how the devil is portrayed in the biblical texts themselves, when in reality, it's a much more sinister and evil picture of this figure. Now, everything we've discussed so far can be safely jettisoned out the window, because in the DLC to Doom Eternal, we find out the great and terrible truth. That it wasn't the Father who created Davoth as the first of his creations. Davoth, the Dark Lord and the Prince of Darkness, was the creator of the Father. And not only the Father, but the Maker Angels and everything else in the cosmos as well. Essentially, as we find out in the DLC to Doom Eternal, how things really went down is that Davoth was the original creator being of everything else. He created the Maker Angels, he created the heavenly realm of Urdak, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the proto-hellscape called Jakad. But as he was searching for immortality, which I guess I'm not sure why he would be searching for immortality in this turn of events, but we'll go with it. As he was searching for immortality, his servants, the Maker Angels, were able to discover the secret to immortality, but they didn't give this information to Davoth. Rather, they trapped him in the realm of Jakad, and one Maker succeeded in removing Davoth's life sphere, or life orb, from his body, killing his physical form. And this Maker who was responsible for this would eventually become the father of the Makers themselves. Despite being able to destroy Davoth forever there, they instead imprisoned him in his life orb and set him in a place where it would be very difficult for anybody to recover. This is actually really interesting and in some ways really original, a depiction of the forces of light and darkness. It's not super uncommon in ancient religion to see a principle of light evenly matched with the principle of darkness. Think about certain forms of Zoroastrian or Zervanism, or Manichaeanism, which drew heavily from both of those. But it is really interesting to see the idea of the creator being betrayed by his creations and being overpowered by them. We see the idea of a lower being of darkness being tricked by his creations with the help of an even higher power in certain forms of Gnosticism, But to my knowledge, the idea of a supreme creator being tricked and deceived and then imprisoned by his own creations and then becoming the devil himself in the process is highly original. At least if there is a story out there, I haven't heard it. Perhaps some obscure tribe in some faraway place. But this isn't an idea that we find in Christian, Gnostic, Jewish, or any other ancient lore that I'm familiar with. Quick interjection, it's me, the editor. The moron talking to you totally forgot about the Greek myth of Zeus overthrowing his father Kronos and Kronos overthrowing his father Uranos. So that is one place where we have the idea of the creator being superseded by his creation, if we count fathers and sons counting as creator-creation distinction. So just thought I'd throw that out there because this guy clearly has no idea what he's talking about. What is interesting, and the wiki says this, so I'm stealing it from them, is that this is sort of what would happen if Satan's rebellion against God, as depicted in Christian lore, succeeded. So basically the created being succeeds in overthrowing the creator being. Now, again, in Christian theology, this literally couldn't happen because God is transcendent beyond all things. It was hubris on the part of Satan to even try. You could no more dethrone God than you could dethrone the ocean. It would be just as difficult in a sense. But in the lore of Doom, because the creator is more like a demiurge, because they're not capable of seeing all things, they're not omniscient, they're not omnipotent, and they're reducible to this life orb thing, where they're sort of reducible to this single point in space and time, it is actually feasible to defeat a creator being like this. Now, one gripe I do have about the way the story is presented is I really would have liked it if they left it so you could interpret it either way. Because there are some codex entries in Doom Eternal that suggest that the Father came first and he created Davoth, and there's other entries that suggest that Davoth came first and he created the Father. But the game actually takes a side. It tells us in the end, in the final battle with Davoth, spoilers again for a game that came out 5 years ago, that Davoth did come first and he did indeed create the Father. I would have liked it much better if they let you come to your own conclusions and kept you guessing the entire time. I think that would have been a lot more fun. But as it is, it's still fine enough of a twist, and I think it still works pretty well within the universe. Towards the end of the second DLC of Doom Eternal, we also find out the great and terrible truth about our protagonist as well. Throughout all three Doom games, and presumably the older ones as well, we play as the Doom Slayer, variously called the Doom Marine, the Slayer. He's typically just called the Slayer, so we'll go with that. The Slayer, as it turns out, is a carbon copy of Davoth himself, and Davoth was working behind the scenes from his spiritual prison to influence the Doom Slayer's production and his induction into the divinity machine, which turned him into this supernatural demon killer. We'll get to that in a second here. But the reason this is interesting is because the Doom Slayer looks just like Davoth. In fact, when Davoth is reincarnated by the Doom Slayer so that he can fight him, the Father, who apparently survives his life orb being destroyed, so that's interesting, says that Davoth is you, referring to the Slayer, in their world. So Davoth is sort of this primordial parallel to the Doom Slayer himself. I'm not sure if there's a deep and encompassing lore explaining how all this works together. If there was, I wasn't able to locate it. But the reason this is interesting is because if this is the case, we could actually understand the Doom Slayer, the person that we play as and the protagonist of this series, as something of an Antichrist figure. The reason I say that is because Davoth's plan for the Doom Marine, as he was being put through this entire system, as he was put through the divinity machine to become this powerful thing, was so that he would ultimately be the one to destroy the Makers and the Father. These were the ones who betrayed and imprisoned him. And so the Doom Slayer, the person we play as, in the game does actually destroy the Makers, he destroys the life sphere of the Father. Basically, everybody who betrayed Davoth is killed by our main character, and that's what he was sort of created for. And the Doom Slayer is something of a parallel of Davoth himself. So he's sort of this physical incarnation of Davoth, still remaining separate from him, who's carrying out Davoth's work in the physical world that Davoth himself can't because he's in a spiritual prison right now. This sounds a lot like the Antichrist for two very important reasons. The first reason is because it's sort of a dark parallel to the Christ. Jesus is the incarnation of God on earth. He's separate from God the Father, being God the Son himself, but he is still fully divine and in full communion with the Father. And he's carrying out God the Father's will on earth as in heaven, as the famous prayer goes. So with Doomguy being sort of this physical incarnation of Davoth, we see sort of this parallel structure to the way that Jesus is the incarnation of God on earth, and the Doomslayer, I can't believe I'm saying this, is the incarnation of Davoth on Earth. It's a weird parallel, but I thought it was really interesting and worth bringing up. So that's point one. Reason number two is we actually have an ancient Christian story of a sort of dark parallel to Jesus in the form of the Antichrist coming about. There's an ancient Jewish Christian document called the Ascension of Isaiah. It's found outside of the New Testament. It was never considered canonical, and it was actually lost at a very early time. It's remarkable we actually have manuscripts of it anymore. But the Ascension of Isaiah depicts Belial, the prince of darkness ruling over the world. Consider him another name for Satan. Taking on flesh, there's a parallel to Jesus in the form of Nero. Now, he's not explicitly called the Antichrist in this text, but Nero was considered by a lot of people to be, if not the Antichrist, the first Antichrist, and certainly the prototype of any Antichrist who's going to come after him. And the parallel is actually really good with Nero, because as the text of this book points out, Nero was the murderer of his own mother. After he ascended to become emperor of Rome, Nero had his own mother killed. And this is a dark parallel of Jesus, who is positively associated with the Virgin Mary and who took care of her basically for the entirety of his earthly life. So Nero's murder of his mother is a dark parallel to Jesus' care for his own mother. So we actually have a story from Christian history of a dark parallel to Jesus Christ coming down in the text themselves. So I'm not saying that the people at Bethesda and id Software knew about this story, but it seems intuitive enough to want to create sort of a dark parallel to Jesus, which the closest thing to Christ would be the Antichrist in that matter. So if we see the Doomslayer as the incarnation of Davoth, the Dark Lord, and the instrument of his work in the physical realm to deal out revenge on the angelic world rather than on the demonic world, you could make the case that Doom Guy is actually the Antichrist. Now remember, in the Theology of Doom, the Father and the Maker angels aren't intrinsically good. The Father of the Bible and Christian theology is intrinsically good. The things he does are objectively good things. But as we've seen, the Father in the Doom universe is flawed. He's capable of making mistakes, and he's not capable of seeing the future. And as we see, the Makers themselves fall to corruption, which has catastrophic results for the rest of the cosmos. So Doom Guy, or the Doom Marine, Doomslayer, being an Antichrist is less of an evil thing as it would be if the Antichrist were to show up today. Again, in Christian theology, the Antichrist is the incarnation of the devil, who is the embodiment of all evil and suffering. Again, think of the terrible things going on Earth right now. That's what the Antichrist would be all about today. But in the Doom universe, it's less good and evil. It's more morally gray. Like, nobody's the good guy here. So if depicting Doom Guy as the Antichrist is uncomfortable for you, you don't have to. But if you can acknowledge the difference in moral polarity in the Doom universe as opposed to Christian theology, then by technicality, I give you permission to call Doom Guy the Doom Antichrist of sorts. One other thing I want to bring up about the Dark Lord in Doom, which is different from Christian theology, is that the Dark Lord in Doom is portrayed as sort of cosmic parallel to the Father. So far, we're tracking pretty good. Satan is in some sense the opposite of God and everything that he stands for. But in modern American Christian tradition, we typically see the idea that Satan rules over hell just like how God rules over heaven. And this is something that's influenced the depiction of the Dark Lord in Doom. The Dark Lord is the ruler of the hell dimension. That's his palace. That's his realm. But in classical Christian thought, and even in the Bible itself, Satan doesn't rule hell. He's a prisoner of hell. He's going to be ultimately tortured for all eternity or destroyed there. So now we've talked a lot about the Dark Lord and the Father. Let's move on to talk about the denizens of their domains, the Maker angels and the demons. For anybody who isn't super familiar with Doom, I'm going to use the word Maker and the word angel interchangeably here. The Makers are the people who live in the domain of the Father, called Urdak, which we'll get to in a second here. And they're very clearly modeled after angels. In fact, they're explicitly called angels in one codex reference. So we're very clearly seeing the angel-inspired imagery applied to these figures. The denizens of hell are called demons. They're just called demons. They're not called Jekadites. So that makes things a little bit easier. But when I say angel and maker, I'm using the two of them interchangeably. So in Doom Eternal, we're given conflicting results over who created the Maker angels. Some say that it was Davoth, while others say that it was the Father. It seems, going along with the narrative that the game itself takes, that Davoth is the ultimate creator of the Maker angels, but it is technically ambiguous. What's also really interesting, we'll talk about more about this when we get to the heaven section, but There are some references to the idea that the makers are actually a collective intelligence, something of a hive mind. Now, Doom the Dark Ages kind of backs off from this a little bit because we see more individual makers have personalities. The Creed maker is, of course, the best example of this, but we even see the maker jailers of the Doomslayer have conversations, which you probably wouldn't need to do if you were just a collective intelligence. So it seems that the Dark Ages backed off from this a little bit, but there still could be something underlying the collective consciousness of all of them. One of the reasons this is interesting is because there's actually a couple theological antecedents to this, not just in Christianity, but in ancient Egyptian religion. So the ancient Egyptians were around for a very long time and over a large span of territory, which means their mythology wasn't super consistent all the time. Some towns had one myth, another town had another myth, so they're contradictory. But one ancient Egyptian creation story tells about how the primordial god Ptah rose up from the waters of chaos, and Ptah divided himself into the various gods of the Egyptian pantheon. So that's to say that the various gods of Egypt, to organize the functions of the cosmos, were all manifestations of this one god. It's part of this beautifully intricate theology that the Egyptians worked out over the course of not even centuries, thousands of years, which is really cool to see. So it's interesting that the idea of a divine collective hive mind is actually present in some ancient texts. Likewise, and this is something I plan to make a video about eventually too, angels in the Old Testament may actually function that same way. The study of angels in the Old Testament is very complicated because there's simultaneously too much information and not enough information. But one model of angels that's been supplied and has been endorsed by several very high-ranking scholars is that angels are less divine persons with personalities of their own and more projections of God himself. So basically, when an angel interacts with somebody in the Old Testament, one theory holds that these angels are actually more like a hologram manifested by God rather than a divine personality which is separate from God. This goes a long way in explaining why sometimes the angel of the Lord and God himself are spoken of as being the same being. So it alleviates some problems there. But anyways, one way or another, I thought that the idea of a hive mind of these angelic figures was actually really interesting because I doubt, again, that the people who made Doom were familiar with that idea, but there it kind of is in the game. So maybe it's just intuitive enough to be able to pick up on it. So I thought that was really cool. Also, some of the high-ranking maker angels are referred to as seraphim. Now, the biblically literate among us will recognize seraphim as a type of divine figure that does show up in the Bible. Seraphim are separate from angels in the Bible, but in more recent centuries, we sort of take any divine figure and put them all under the category of angels. That's technically inaccurate. Seraphim are seraphim, angels are angels, cherubim are cherubim, etc., but it's an understandable conflation to make. So the idea of maker angels being seraphim is again drawing from biblical lore. In the Bible, the seraphim are throne guardians of God. They're not depicted as being humanoid. There's probably some serpentine imagery involved there, and they're depicted as having lots of eyes and lots of wings. They primarily show up in the vision of Isaiah, which can be found in, shocking, the book of Isaiah. Very fun stuff. So the idea of seraphim being high-ranking angels, while a bit anachronistic and a bit conflationary, is drawing from biblical imagery and biblical data. And what's further interesting about this is that in the medieval period and in late antiquity before it, the idea of seraphim being, if not the highest, among the highest ranks of angels, was codified by an author named Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. If you've heard of the 9 choirs of angels, you all owe a lot of that thought to Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a pseudonymous writer who wrote around 500 AD, and he organized the different names of angels that we find in the Old Testament and in ancient tradition into the 9 choirs, one of the highest of these being the seraphim. Now it's interesting too that unlike the angels of the Bible or the seraphim of the Bible, the maker angels aren't immortal. They are physical and they are capable of dying. In fact, you kill quite a few of them in Doom Eternal. But what's really interesting is that they seem to die of natural causes as well. They get old and die. It takes a very long time for them to do that, but eventually they undergo a process called transfiguration, which is essentially death for them. But they can prolong the onset of transfiguration by the use of argent energy. Argent energy, as we find out, is what most of the Doom games center around. And again, it's an energy derived from basically rendered human and sentient life souls, which the makers harvest in order to basically prolong their own lifespans. So again, they're based on angels, but they don't have the morality of angels. So that's enough about angels. Let's talk about demons now. Demons in Doom are actually really interesting and surprisingly divergent from Christian lore. In Christianity, demons are typically assumed to be fallen angels. These were created good by God the Father, and who fell in the rebellion against God with Satan and became demons after that point. In Christian tradition, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We'll make a video about that eventually, but suffice it to say that most people accept that demons are fallen angels, and this is pretty popular in the zeitgeist as well. But in Doom, we find that demons were originally humans, or various forms of sentient life. Basically, these are humans or other things which have been tortured and exposed to argent energy such that they mutate into the terrible demonic figures that we see here. So it's interesting that in a game that clearly draws a lot on Christian tradition and on religious traditions from other parts of the world, they decided to go their own way here, which I think is kind of neat. The demons in Doom are very fleshy and very somatic, which is unlike normal depictions of demons in classical Christianity. But in medieval depictions of demons, we see a lot more of a bodily, sort of physical depiction of ugly imps and things of that nature, which very clearly exercise an influence on the imagery of Doom and Doom Eternal. Another source of inspiration, clearly, for the imagery of demons in Doom is the, especially album covers and general artwork of late 20th century metal bands. The demons that we see in Doom could very clearly be an album cover for an Iron Maiden song. So very clearly drawing from sort of the common cultural zeitgeist as well, but it's interesting that the traditional depictions of demons in older Christian art tends on the more shadowy and elusive, whereas in the medieval era we started to see more and more of these fleshy, somatic things culminating in the popular zeitgeist, which led to both the depictions in Doom and the depictions on these metal albums. So I thought that was a really interesting trajectory. Now, I should note before we move on that there is one reference to humans becoming demons, and this comes from a work by Hesiod called Works and Days. This is a very ancient Greek composition, perhaps almost as old as the Iliad and the Odyssey, although probably not quite. And in this depiction, we see that humankind goes through several successive ages, each one decreasing in strength. So it starts with the Golden Age, moves on to the Silver Age, and so on and so forth. The souls of Golden Age humans are said to be, once they became deceased, become daemons, or demons in common parlance. And these weren't demons as in the evil imps that are, hiding around every corner looking to cause mischief, but rather in Greek thought, daemons of the souls of the humans of the Golden Age were actually these divine intermediaries, these things that lived in between the human sphere below and the divine realm above, and which were generally either neutral or benevolent to people. So there is an example of a human origin for demons there, but they didn't mean by demon what the creators of Doom meant by demon. So I don't think it was a direct influence, but nevertheless, something really interesting to point out, I think. It's worth noting too that in most ancient cultures, like those in Mesopotamia and Egypt, demons really didn't have a point of origin. They were just kind of a part of the world, just sort of something intrinsic to the flow of natural tides, the ebb and flow of nature. All right, we've talked about the Father and the Prince of Darkness, we've talked about angels and demons, now it's time to talk about heaven and hell. So, heaven in the Doom universe is a place called Urdak. Urdak is claimed in the codices of Doom Eternal to be an ancient word for heaven. I tried looking through some of the oldest languages on Earth, primarily Sumerian, for references to the word Urdak, and I couldn't find any word for heaven that corresponded to it. So, I'm guessing it was an invention of Bethesda and id Software that was sort of playing with certain ideas, but it doesn't seem to have actually been an ancient word for heaven. The Sumerian word for heaven, of course, was An, from which we derived the name Anu, for a high god of heaven. But what is interesting is that there is an ancient Mesopotamian element to this name, Ur was the name of an ancient city. There was another ancient city called Uruk in Mesopotamia, and these were some of the oldest cities that humankind ever produced. So if you want to invoke the idea of something primordial and ancient, choosing Ur is actually a really good element for a name of that. Where the Dak comes from and what it means, I don't know, but at least choosing Ur for part of this does lend an air of sort of antiquity and primordiality to it. So points to them for doing that. It's also interesting that the Doom lore goes out of its way to describe Urdak, or heaven, as being an upper dimension, and Jikad, or hell, as being a lower dimension. So clearly playing with the imagery of heaven being above us and hell being below us. This is pretty common theological imagery in Christian tradition, although it typically goes back to substantially older traditions which saw a three-tiered world system, where you have the realm of humans on the, realm of earth, you have the realm of the gods in heaven on the divine level, and then you have the underworld below them. Now, what's interesting is that in those ancient systems, which did influence early Christian imagery in some ways, there was typically less, I would say, moral polarity. So they didn't think of the underworld as being a place of evil, it's just where the dead people go. In a similar way, the gods of the underworld weren't evil devils trying to kill people, they were just busy trying to make sure that the dead stay dead and making sure things go on properly down there. Likewise, the gods of heaven weren't always benevolent. They were, if anybody's read the Iliad or the Odyssey, then you know how the ancients saw the divine realm. It was a little bit more human-like than we're used to with Christian theology. But nevertheless, the idea of a three-tiered system is very old. But with Christianity, and some other religions as well, we see the moral polarization of these ideas. The underworld being inhabited by demons and the dead being a place where you don't want to go, and the heavenly realm being a place occupied by the good people and, of course, the good God there as well, with the human plane stuck being pulled in both directions in between. So the imagery of Urdak being the high realm and Jakad being the low realm is very clearly playing with that imagery, and it's borrowing directly from the Christianized imagery of hell, the lower place being evil, and heaven, the higher place being good. Now again, one important distinction between Jakad or hell in Doom and the hell of Christian theology is that in Jakad, in the Doom universe, we find it to be a populated place. There appear to be citizens and other people who are native to that area, and they organize it in a way that seems to suggest a certain amount of society. They have priests, they have princes, they have a Dark Lord, and a whole organizational system. And again, this is drawn from some late classical Christian imagery as well, like that in John Milton's Paradise Lost. But most of Christian theology sees hell not as the realm that Satan rules, but rather as the place where Satan will inevitably be punished. It's not his mansion, it's his prison. And again, in Dante's Inferno, we find Satan to be the ultimate prisoner of hell. This is proper Christian theology, and it has its roots in the book of Revelation itself, where the devil is chained and imprisoned for thousands of years, which probably had some influence on the idea of Davoth being locked in a life sphere. But anyways, I thought it was an important distinction to make because a lot of times, again, we imagine the Christian depiction of good and evil to be an equal match between God on the one side and the devil on the other side, whereas in actual Christian theology, hell is the prison of the devil, not his palace. Now that we've covered God and the devil, heaven and hell, angels and demons, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of the night sentinels, because surprisingly, they draw on a lot of Christian imagery and a lot of paracanonical imagery as well, which kind of surprised me, but here it is. So perhaps the most interesting thing about the Night Sentinels is the idea of the World Spear. This is something that we see in Doom the Ancient Gods, which is the DLC for Doom Eternal, and it's this massive crystal spear fragment or massive crystalline thing that has slammed itself into the Sentinel, I believe homeworld, if not homeworld in one of their planets. And in the lore, we know that it was this object making contact with the planet that released these figures called the Wraiths. When the World Spear made contact with the Night Sentinel world, it either released from underground or brought along with it from heaven the Wraith figures. The Wraiths were sources of infinite power and knowledge that the Night Sentinels took advantage of to advance their civilization. Now, pausing there just for a moment, in either case, whether the Wraiths were released from the underworld of sorts, or whether they arrived on this cosmic shard from the heavens, in either case there's a parallel to the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch depicts the fall of the Watchers, divine angels who came down to earth and taught humankind how to make weapons, similarly to how humans developed weaponsmithing skills shortly after the arrival of the Wraiths. So we already see a parallel in divine angels coming down with the idea that the Wraiths were borne aloft by the World Spear. But if indeed the Wraiths were underground the whole time and were released by the impact of the World Spear, there's still contact with the Book of Enoch here, or at least the ideas contained within it. Because at the end of one part of the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, the divine spirits who came down to earth, are imprisoned, and their prison is specifically deep, deep underneath the earth. So whether the Wraiths were borne aloft by the World Spear or were released from the bowels of the earth, in either case, there's a surprising point of contact with the Book of Enoch. I was honestly expecting Doom to draw a lot more on the Book of Enoch. I don't think it did nearly as much as it could have, so I was a little bit disappointed by it, but this may have been an intentional parallel to it. It's also interesting that the arrival of the Wraiths precipitated the increase in civilization and the ability to produce weaponry by the Night Sentinels. These are two parallels that also are found in the Book of Enoch, because when the Watcher Angels came down to live among humankind, they brought with them the arts of civilization, one of which the narrative calls out specifically, was the art of war making, so producing swords, armor, and such, which happened at the behest of an angel called Azazel. Finally, the Wraiths begat Titan offspring, which I think are identifiable with the massive Titans in Doom, although I think the reference was a little bit unclear when I read that one. But one way or another, some of the massive fauna that we experience in the Doom games are the direct offspring of the Wraiths. And this is another parallel to the Book of Enoch as well, where the offspring of the fallen Watcher angels with humankind are giants. And the giants are explicitly called Titans in Greek translations of the Book of Enoch, going back to the Greek manuscripts that we find in late antiquity. It was after exposure to Wraith energy that the Night Sentinel civilization truly began to flourish, and it was at this point that they made contact with the Maker Angels. So the Maker Angels appearing to the Night Sentinels, again, is an interesting parallel to the idea of angelic mediation or angelic revelation. Angels appearing out of nowhere and bringing with them news of the, shall we call it, divine realm of sorts. A very religious idea found primarily in the Bible, although there are interesting parallels in other religions as well. What's also interesting is that the Maker Angels offered the Night Sentinels the gift of immortality. This sounds a lot like the gospel message that's evangelized by Christians today. Believe in Jesus so you can have eternal life. This is being brought to the Night Sentinels by the Maker Angels. Very interesting parallel there. It's also interesting that the Makers brought with them this gift in exchange for the Night Sentinels adopting, as the Doom games themselves call it, Maker Law. So what seems to be happening here is we have some inspiration drawn from the Law of Moses, this idea of a divine law from the divine realm being brought down to humankind, the reward for following which is immortality, even though immortality didn't become a reward for the Mosaic Law until a long time after the Iron Age Kingdom of Israel. But nevertheless, still very interesting. It's after the Night Sentinels make their deal with the Maker Angels that the Doom Marine enters the scene, and that's where the rest of the story of Doom the Dark Ages, Doom 2016, and Doom Eternal takes place. So I won't spoil that for you, even though I've spoiled pretty much the entire lore of the series, but go play the games, they're very fun. But before we leave, I want to talk a little bit more about the aesthetics of Doom, because it's kind of interesting the different inspirations that they drew from for creating the worlds of heaven, hell, and the like. Now, I'm neither an artist nor an architect, but it is interesting that you can see a lot of the inspirations for the imagery of Doom. So, for instance, the Sentinel architecture seems to be loosely based on Eastern Orthodox, ancient Greek Christian architecture in particular, but there's also some imagery of Western Christianity there as well, where there's ideas of cathedrals and Western churches whose architecture is incorporated into both hellish and heavenish architectural styles. It's also interesting that when we're looking at the runes of both the Maker Angels and of Hell, there's clearly a variety of inspirations being drawn from here. The Maker runes remind me specifically of the classical zodiac signs used in the Enlightenment period and the Renaissance before it for the depictions of the various signs of the zodiac. And the demon runes are actually an interesting conflation of a couple different influences. So, of course, we have the sort of modern era occultism that they're drawing from. Pentagrams abound everywhere, of course. But what's also interesting is that in some of the symbols, you see a little triangle appear at the top of a vertical line, and that triangle seems to be reminiscent of ancient cuneiform, which is the form of writing used for Sumerian, Akkadian, which is the Babylonian language, to oversimplify, and languages like Ugaritic. So it's interesting that they're drawing from those sources as well. I also caught some imagery from other esoteric organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, or a little bit from Freemasonry here and there. But it's very clear that they're drawing from this sort of hodgepodge of various different imagery sources to produce something very new. And I think it works out pretty well. It's really neat. I also wanted to work to confirm the suspicions of some of you when you saw the Tower of Necroval for the first time. So in Doom Eternal, the Tower of Necroval is one of the Argent refining facilities. And if you looked at that tower and you thought, that looks familiar, that's because it should be. Because that architecture is very clearly inspired by Peter Bruegel Sr.'s art of the Tower of Babel. A similar depiction also occurs in Gustave Doré's illumination of the Bible, his woodcuts, which also represent a very similar sort of spiral pattern of the Tower of Babel. What's interesting is that the reason these depictions depict the Tower of Babel is going in a spiral is because the Tower of Babel was an ancient Mesopotamian ziggurat. Unfortunately, in the times of these artistic representations, ziggurats no longer existed. They hadn't for several centuries, if not several thousand years by that time. So when people went over to the Middle East, they didn't see ziggurats, they saw mosques. And the Great Mosque of Samarra has a spiral pattern to it. So apparently people from the West went over to the Middle East, the place where Babylon once was, and other Mesopotamian civilizations, saw this architecture style and assumed that this is what the ziggurats must have looked like, these stairways to heaven. In fact, this is not what the ziggurats looked like. The ziggurats looked more like this. So it's an interesting and convoluted history of imagery that we have there. But again, if anybody thought that the Tower of Nekrval looked familiar, it is derived from a Western interpretation of a mosque which they thought was a ziggurat drawing on the Tower of Babel. I don't know what to tell you, man. That's just kind of the way that the cookie crumbled there. And that is the Theology of Doom. Again, I don't think Doom has a systematic theology to it, so it's kind of hard to tap into all the little nuances and break them all down, but I wanted to hit the major points anyways, getting across ideas of God and Satan, heaven and hell, angels and demons, and the Tower of Babel, apparently. So, thank you all so much for joining me today. If you like this sort of content, feel free to check out some of the other videos I did. And if anybody is disappointed that I didn't hit on the more Lovecraftian elements of Doom the Dark Ages, that's because I've already done a video on Lovecraft-inspired themes in religious literature. So feel free to go fishing for that one if you'd like. But seriously, thank you all so much for sticking with me to the end of this one. There is more to come. I plan on uploading weekly from this point onwards. So if you like this, feel free to subscribe and stick around. And I'll see everybody in the next video. Take care of yourselves in the meantime. I'll see you all soon.